The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of classroom 302, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Professor James Morgan wrote another equation on the board, the chalk scratching against the surface as 30 pairs of eyes followed his every move. The advanced calculus class was his favorite to teach. These students had proven themselves worthy of his time, unlike the freshmen who still struggled with basic concepts. And this, he said, underlining the final result with a sharp stroke, is how we approach multivariable optimization problems when dealing with constrained environments. He turned to face the class, scanning the rows of young, attentive faces. Some nodded along while others frantically scribbled in their notebooks. The classroom door creaked open, breaking the rhythm of his lecture. Professor Morgan paused mid-sentence, his eyebrows drawing together in annoyance. He was strict about punctuality. 15 minutes into the class was unacceptable, regardless of the excuse. But it wasn't a late student who stood in the doorway. Instead, an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun peered into the room. She wore a simple blue cardigan over a floral dress, and her hands, noticeably weathered with prominent veins and age spots, clutched a worn leather handbag. The students turned in their seats, curious about the interruption. A few exchanged confused glances, while others hid smiles behind their hands. "I'm terribly sorry to interrupt," the woman said, her voice soft but clear. "Is this advanced calculus with Professor Morgan?" Professor Morgan straightened his posture, adjusting his glasses with one hand. "Yes, it is, and we're in the middle of a lecture." He didn't try to hide the edge in his voice. "This is a senior-level university course, ma'am. Perhaps you're looking for a different room?" The woman took a tentative step into the classroom. "No, I believe I'm in the right place." She smiled, revealing laugh lines that deepened around her eyes. "My name is Eleanor Thompson. I spoke with the administration office about auditing some classes. They said it would be fine." Whispers rippled through the classroom. One student in the front row leaned toward his friend. "Auditing? Like, she wants to take the class?" Professor Morgan set his chalk down with deliberate slowness. In his 20 years of teaching, he'd never had someone her age, she had to be at least 75, asked to join his advanced courses. The continuing education program occasionally brought in older students, but they typically enrolled in art history or literature, not the most challenging mathematics course the university offered. "Mrs. Thompson, was it?" he asked, folding his arms across his chest. "Ms. Thompson," she corrected gently. "Never married. Too busy with other things, I suppose." A hint of something, perhaps regret, perhaps pride, flickered across her face. "Ms. Thompson," he continued, "this is an advanced calculus course that builds on several prerequisite classes. We're currently covering complex optimization theories and multivariate calculus. I'm afraid you might find it challenging to follow along without the proper background." Eleanor's smile didn't waver. "Oh, I understand. And please call me Eleanor. I don't expect special treatment, Professor. I'm just here to listen and learn. Math has always been a hobby of mine, and now that I'm retired, I finally have time to properly study it." A hobby. Professor Morgan almost scoffed out loud. Mathematics wasn't a hobby. It was a rigorous discipline that required years of dedicated study. He glanced at the clock on the wall, aware that precious minutes were ticking away. "Very well," he said curtly. "You may take a seat in the back, but please try not to disrupt the class." Eleanor nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Professor. You won't even know I'm here." The students watched as she made her way to an empty desk in the back row. She moved slowly but purposefully, setting down her handbag and retrieving a simple notebook and pencil. No laptop, no fancy calculator, just the basics. A few students continued to stare, but most turned their attention back to the front of the room. Professor Morgan cleared his throat. "As I was saying before the interruption," he turned back to the board, determined to get his lecture back on track. For the remainder of the class, he found his attention occasionally drifting to the elderly woman in the back row. Unlike some of his younger students who checked their phones or stared blankly out the window, Eleanor remained completely focused. Her pencil moved steadily across her notebook, and her eyes never left the board. When the class ended, the students packed up quickly, eager to escape into the late afternoon sunshine. Professor Morgan noticed that several of them glanced curiously at Eleanor as they left, but none approached her. She took her time gathering her things, carefully placing her pencil and notebook back into her handbag. As she stood to leave, Professor Morgan found himself walking toward her, driven by curiosity he couldn't quite explain. "Ms. Thompson," he said, "may I ask what sparked your interest in advanced calculus?" Eleanor looked up at him, her blue eyes bright despite the wrinkles that framed them. "Numbers have always made sense to me, Professor. More sense than people sometimes." She chuckled softly. "I used to solve math problems for fun while I worked as a telephone operator back in the day. The company had these big mainframe computers, and I'd watch the engineers work during my breaks." Professor Morgan nodded politely, though he remained skeptical. Watching engineers work decades ago hardly prepared someone for the complex concepts he taught in his class. "Well, I hope you found today's lecture interesting at least," he said, already mentally preparing for the faculty meeting he needed to attend. "Oh, very much so," Eleanor replied enthusiastically. "Although I noticed you used the Lagrangian method for the optimization problem, have you ever considered the Kuhn-Tucker approach? It might offer your students a more elegant solution in certain cases." Professor Morgan froze, staring at her in surprise. The KKT conditions were indeed an alternative approach, but they weren't covered in the undergraduate curriculum. They were typically reserved for graduate-level optimization theory. "You're familiar with the KKT conditions?" he asked, unable to keep the disbelief from his voice. Eleanor's cheeks colored slightly, just a bit. "Like I said, it's been a hobby of mine for many years." Before he could respond, another professor poked his head into the room. "James, the department meeting starts in 5 minutes. Dean Wilson is already there." "I'll be right there," Professor Morgan called back. He turned to Eleanor again, his curiosity now fully piqued. "Will you be joining us for the next class?" She nodded, a hint of excitement in her eyes. "If that's all right with you, I promise I won't be a bother." "It's fine," he said, his tone softer than before. "I'll see you on Thursday then." As he hurried to his meeting, Professor Morgan found himself thinking about Eleanor Thompson. He had dismissed her initially, an old woman playing at being a student, likely seeking a way to pass her retirement years. But that casual reference to the KKT condition suggested there might be more to her than met the eye. Over the next few days, Eleanor's presence in his classroom became less of an anomaly and more of a curiosity. She arrived early, always taking the same seat in the back row. She never asked questions during class, never drew attention to herself, but her focus never wavered. Professor Morgan found himself glancing her way more often, watching her pencil move across the page as she took notes. Some of the students had begun to notice his interest in the elderly audit student. He overheard them in the hallway, speculating about who she was and why she was there. "Maybe she's some famous mathematician in disguise," one suggested jokingly. "Or she's just lonely and has nowhere else to go," another replied. "I bet she's the professor's mother checking up on his teaching," a third added, causing the others to laugh. None of them had bothered to speak to her directly, Professor Morgan realized. To them, she was just an oddity, a break in the routine of university life. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about Eleanor Thompson, something that didn't quite fit with his initial assessment. As the second week of her attendance began, Professor Morgan decided it was time to find out exactly what this elderly woman knew about advanced mathematics. If she was simply there to pass the time, as he still suspected, a challenging problem would quickly reveal her limitations. And if, by some remote chance, she actually understood the material, well, that would be interesting indeed. Little did he know that his small test would lead to a discovery that would change not only his perspective on teaching, but his understanding of the hidden talents that sometimes go unrecognized in the most unexpected people. 2 weeks had passed since Eleanor Thompson first walked into Professor Morgan's advanced calculus class. The initial whispers and curious glances from students had mostly faded. Eleanor had become a fixture in the back row, always punctual, always attentive. her silver hair catching the afternoon sunlight as she bent over her notebook. Professor Morgan tried to ignore her presence, but he couldn't help noticing little things. The way she nodded slightly when he explained a particularly complex concept. The small smile that appeared when he solved an equation using an elegant approach. The thoughtful expression when a student asked a challenging question. What bothered him most was that he couldn't figure her out. Was she actually following the material? Or just pretending to understand? The brief conversation about the KKT conditions still nagged at him. It could have been a lucky guess or something she'd heard somewhere without truly understanding it. Today, Professor Morgan announced, writing a series of symbols on the board. We'll tackle second-order differential equations with variable coefficients. He turned to face the class, chalk dust coating his fingers. This is where many students hit a wall, so pay close attention. The classroom was quieter than usual. Midterms were approaching, and the pressure was beginning to show on many young faces. Dark circles under eyes, coffee cups on desks, nervous tapping of pens, all signs of late-night study sessions and mounting anxiety. As Professor Morgan worked through several examples, he noticed a student in the front row, Tyler, one of his more promising pupils, looking increasingly frustrated. "Professor," Tyler finally spoke up, "I'm not following how you got from step 3 to step 4. Could you explain that again?" Professor Morgan nodded and began to walk through the solution more slowly. The key here is recognizing that this portion of the equation can be treated as a separate function that we can integrate by parts. Tyler's frown deepened. "I'm still not seeing it. Why wouldn't we apply the standard form here?" Several other students nodded in agreement, confusion evident on their faces. Professor Morgan felt a familiar frustration building. He'd explained this concept clearly. Why weren't they getting it? From the corner of his eye, he caught a movement. Eleanor had shifted in her seat, her head tilted slightly as if she wanted to say something but was holding back. A sudden impulse seized him. Part curiosity, part irritation. "Miss Thompson," he called out, his voice sharper than he'd intended. "Perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on this problem?" The classroom fell silent. All heads turned toward the back row, where Eleanor sat frozen, clearly surprised at being addressed. The students' expressions ranged from confusion to barely concealed amusement. Some exchanged glances, anticipating an awkward moment. Eleanor began, then cleared her throat. "I wouldn't want to interrupt your teaching, Professor." "Oh, I insist," Professor Morgan said, extending the chalk toward her. "You've been auditing this class for 2 weeks now. I'm curious to see what you've absorbed." He expected her to decline, to admit she was out of her depth. Part of him, a part he wasn't proud of, wanted to expose her as a dilettante, to prove that his initial dismissal had been justified. Instead, Eleanor slowly rose from her seat. The wooden chair scraped against the floor as she pushed it back. She smoothed her cardigan with wrinkled hands and made her way to the front of the classroom. Every step was measured, unhurried, yet purposeful. A few students straightened in their seats, suddenly interested. Others looked uncomfortable, as if witnessing something inappropriate, like watching a child being called to the principal's office. Eleanor took the chalk from Professor Morgan's hand. He stepped back, arms folded across his chest, and gestured toward the half-completed equation on the board. "The issue," he explained for the benefit of the class, "is solving this second-order differential equation with variable coefficients." He pointed to where he'd left off. "Tyler is struggling with the transition from this step to the next." Eleanor studied the board silently. The chalk looked fragile in her weathered hand. For a moment, Professor Morgan wondered if he'd made a mistake. Perhaps this was too cruel, putting an elderly woman on the spot like this. But then Eleanor began to write. Her handwriting was neat and precise, smaller than Professor Morgan's, but perfectly legible. She started by drawing a line under the last step he had written, then continued the solution using a slightly different approach. "If we look at this from another angle," she said, her voice soft but steady, "we can recognize a pattern here that simplifies our work considerably." The students watched in stunned silence as Eleanor methodically worked through the problem. There was no hesitation in her movements, no uncertainty in her logic. Each step followed naturally from the last, creating a path through the mathematical wilderness that seemed obvious once revealed. You see, she continued, addressing Tyler directly, the standard form works in many cases, but here it creates unnecessary complications. This alternative approach, when she underlined a key transformation, reduces the number of steps and makes the pattern more visible. Professor Morgan found himself staring at her work with growing astonishment. Not only was she solving the UI problem correctly, but she was doing it with an elegance and clarity that he himself might not have achieved. The approach she used wasn't in the textbook, yet it was mathematically sound and remarkably intuitive. When she finished, she placed the chalk back on the ledge and dusted off her hands. "Does that help clarify things, young man?" she asked Tyler, who was looking at her with wide eyes. Yes," Tyler managed. That's actually much clearer. Thank you." Eleanor nodded and turned to Professor Morgan. "Is that satisfactory, Professor? Or would you like me to explain further?" Professor Morgan struggled to keep his expression neutral. "That was quite adequate, Miss Thompson. Thank you for the demonstration." As Eleanor made her way back to her seat, the classroom remained eerily quiet. The students were processing what they'd just witnessed. An elderly woman who looked like she should be knitting sweaters for grandchildren had just solved a complex mathematical problem with apparent ease. Professor Morgan cleared his throat. "Let's continue with the next example," he said, turning back to the board. But his mind was elsewhere. Who was this woman? Where had she learned advanced mathematics? And why was she sitting in his classroom pretending to be a novice? The remainder of the class passed in a blur. Professor Morgan went through the motions, explaining concepts and working through problems. But his thoughts kept returning to Eleanor and her surprising demonstration. When the class ended, the students filed out, many of them glancing back at Eleanor with newfound respect or curiosity. A few even nodded to her or gave small smiles, the first acknowledgement she'd received from them. Professor Morgan gathered his notes, watching as Eleanor packed her things with the same careful movements she always used. He needed to speak with her, to understand what had just happened. "Miss Thompson," he called as she stood to leave. "May I have a word with you?" Eleanor paused, then approached his desk. "Of course, Professor." The classroom was empty now, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. For a moment, neither spoke. "Where did you learn that method?" Professor Morgan finally asked. "It's not in any of the standard undergraduate texts." Eleanor smiled, the wrinkles around, her eyes deepening. "I've been studying mathematics for a long time, Professor. You pick up different approaches over the years. But you're not just auditing this class for fun, are you?" he pressed. "You clearly have advanced knowledge of the subject." She adjusted, the strap of her handbag on her shoulder. "I never claimed to be a beginner, Professor. I said mathematics has been a hobby of mine, and that's true. I simply wanted to experience a formal classroom setting. I never had that opportunity when I was younger." Professor Morgan leaned against his desk, studying her face. The initial irritation he'd felt toward her had been replaced by genuine curiosity. "Why, now?" he asked. "After all these years, why come to a university class?" Eleanor's gaze drifted to the window, where the campus grounds stretched out in the golden light of late afternoon. "I've been alone for a long time," she said quietly. "After I retired from my job at the phone company, there wasn't much to fill my days. My sister passed last year. She was the last of my family." She looked back at him, a hint of defiance in her blue eyes. "I decided it was time to stop waiting for permission to do the things I always wanted to do." Something in her words struck a chord with Professor Morgan. How many dreams had he set aside in his own life, waiting for the right moment, the right circumstances? "Well," he said, his tone softer than before, "you certainly have a talent for it. Your approach to that problem today was impressive." A slight blush colored Eleanor's cheeks. "Thank you, Professor. That means a lot coming from you." As she turned to leave, Professor Morgan called after her. "Ms. Thompson?" She paused at the door. "Tomorrow's class will cover applications of differential equations in physics. he said. "I'd be interested in hearing your perspective, if you're willing to share it." Eleanor's face brightened with a smile that seemed to erase years from her appearance. "I'd like that very much, Professor Morgan. I'll see you tomorrow." As the door closed behind her, Professor Morgan sat at his desk, thinking about Eleanor, Thompson, and the assumptions he'd made. He'd been teaching for over 20 years, but today, he felt as though he was the one who had learned something important. Word had spread quickly around the mathematics department. By the next morning, Professor Morgan had received 3 emails from colleagues asking about the elderly math prodigy in his calculus class. The department secretary stopped him in the hallway to ask if the rumors were true. Even Dean Wilson had poked his head into Professor Morgan's office with a curious expression. "So, James," the dean had said with an amused smile, "I hear you've got a grandmother solving equations that stump your best students. Should we be offering her a teaching position?" Professor Morgan had brushed off the comments with forced laughter, but privately he couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor Thompson. He'd spent hours the previous evening going through old textbooks, trying to find the method she'd used to solve the differential equation. He finally discovered it in a Russian mathematics journal from the 1970s, an elegant approach that had never gained widespread adoption in Western teaching. How had Eleanor learned it? The question nagged at him as he prepared for the day's class. The lecture hall was unusually full that afternoon. Several students who regularly skipped had mysteriously decided to attend. 2 graduate teaching assistants from the department loitered near the back, pretending to organize papers. Even Professor Chen from the physics department was there, claiming he just happened to be passing by. Everyone was waiting for Eleanor. She arrived 5 minutes before class was scheduled. To begin, wearing the same blue cardigan but with a different floral dress. If she noticed the increased attendance or the curious stares, she gave no indication. She simply took her usual seat in the back row and arranged her notebook and pencil on the desk with practiced precision. Professor Morgan cleared his throat. "Today we'll be examining the applications of differential equations in physical systems." He wrote several equations on the board, conscious of the unusual attention focused on his class. Specifically, we'll look at how these mathematical tools help us model and predict behaviors in mechanics, thermodynamics, and electromagnetism. As he lectured, he found himself repeatedly glancing toward Eleanor. She was listening with her usual concentration, occasionally making notes in her notebook. Nothing about her demeanor suggested she was aware of her newfound celebrity. Halfway through the class, Professor Morgan decided to address the situation head-on. He wrote a complex equation on the board, one that described the behavior of an oscillating system with damping effects. "This particular problem," he announced, "can be approached in several ways. Yesterday, Ms. Thompson demonstrated an alternative method for solving differential equations." He turned toward the back of the classroom. "Ms. Thompson, would you be willing to share your insights on this problem as well?" The room fell silent. Every head turned toward Eleanor, who looked momentarily surprised at being addressed. Then, a small smile crossed her face. "I'd be happy to, Professor," she said, rising from her seat. As Eleanor made her way to the front of the classroom, Professor Morgan noticed how different the atmosphere was from the previous day. Gone were the smirks and skeptical glances. Instead, the students watched her with genuine curiosity and respect. The story of yesterday's demonstration had clearly made an impression. Eleanor took the chalk from Professor Morgan with a steady hand. She studied the equation for a moment, then began to write. Her approach was methodical, her explanations clear and concise. She drew on concepts from both mathematics and physics, making connections that illuminated the underlying principles. "The beauty of this system," she said as she worked, "is that the mathematics reveals something profound about the physical world. These aren't just symbols on a board, they're descriptions of how reality behaves at its core." Her passion for the subject was evident in every word, every movement. This wasn't simply knowledge acquired through study. This was understanding born from deep appreciation and years of contemplation. When she finished her solution, the classroom erupted in spontaneous applause. Eleanor looked startled. Then, pleased, a blush spreading across her weathered cheeks. Professor Chen from the physics department stepped forward. That was remarkable, he said. Your approach combines elements of both analytical mechanics and modern control theory. May I ask where you studied? Eleanor handed the chalk back to Professor Morgan. I'm self-taught mostly, she replied. I worked for the telephone company for 40 years, but mathematics was always my true love. Self-taught? Professor Chen looked astonished. But your understanding of these concepts is sophisticated, graduate level at least. Eleanor shrugged slightly. When you love something, you find time for it, even if it's just an hour before bed or early in the morning before work. I had a small collection of textbooks I'd saved up to buy, and the public library had a decent mathematics section. Later, when the internet came along, it opened up a whole new world of learning. Professor Morgan found himself staring at Eleanor with newfound respect. He'd spent his entire career in academia, surrounded by resources, colleagues, and institutional support. The idea of mastering advanced mathematics in isolation, driven solely by personal passion, was humbling. Ms. Thompson, he said, would you mind telling us a bit more about your journey with mathematics? I think we all could learn something valuable from your experience. Eleanor looked around at the expectant faces watching her. For a moment, she seemed uncertain, as if unaccustomed to being the center of attention. Then she nodded. I suppose. My story begins when I was a girl, she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. I was always good with numbers. Could add and multiply faster than anyone in my class. My 8th grade teacher, Mrs. Donovan, noticed my ability and gave me extra problems to solve. She was the first person who told me I had a special talent for mathematics. Eleanor's eyes took on a distant look, as if seeing far beyond the classroom walls. I wanted to study mathematics in college, but my father didn't believe in higher education for women. What's the point? He'd say. You'll just get married and have babies. It was 1952, and that's how most people thought back then. Several female students in the class exchanged glances. One young woman in the front row was shaking her head in quiet disbelief. Instead, I took a job at the telephone company after high school, Eleanor continued. I was a switchboard operator at first, then moved into the billing department because of my skill with numbers. It was during my lunch breaks that I first noticed the engineers working with the early computers, massive machines that filled entire rooms. I was fascinated by them. Professor Morgan leaned against his desk, the scheduled lecture completely forgotten. The entire room was captivated by Eleanor's story. One day, an engineer named Robert noticed me watching. Instead of shooing me away, he explained what they were doing, programming the machines to solve complex calculations. He showed me the mathematics behind their work, and I was hooked. Robert became my mentor, secretly lending me books and papers that I'd study at night in my apartment. Eleanor smiled at the memory. Robert told me I had a natural intuition for mathematics that he'd rarely seen. He said it was a crime that I wasn't at a university. He even tried to convince me to apply to college. But by then I was supporting my mother after my father passed, and leaving wasn't an option. The room was silent except for Eleanor's voice. Even Professor Chen had taken a seat, listening intently. Over the years, I created my own curriculum. Classical analysis, differential equations, number theory, abstract algebra. I studied them all. Sometimes I'd hit a concept I couldn't understand, and I'd struggle for weeks or months until it finally clicked. Without formal training, I developed my own approaches to problems, not always knowing if they were correct by academic standards. She gestured to the equation on the board. That's why some of my methods might seem unusual. They're paths I found on my own through the mathematical wilderness. A student raised her hand. Didn't you ever want to publish your work or share it with others? Eleanor shook her head. Who would have been interested in the mathematical musings of a telephone company employee with no degree? Besides, the joy was in the discovery itself, in understanding the elegant patterns that underlie our universe. Professor Morgan found himself deeply moved by Eleanor's story. He thought of all the brilliant minds that had been lost to science and mathematics throughout history, simply because of prejudice or lack of opportunity. Ms. Thompson, he said, I believe we've all been given a valuable lesson today. One, that goes beyond differential equations or physics applications. Thank you for sharing your story with us." The classroom broke into applause again, louder this time. Eleanor looked around at the smiling faces, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, "for listening, for making an old woman feel valued." As she returned to her seat, something had changed in the classroom atmosphere. The invisible barrier between Eleanor and the rest of the class had dissolved. Several students leaned toward her, asking questions, expressing admiration. The graduate teaching assistants were furiously taking notes. Professor Chen was deep in conversation with another faculty member who had slipped into the room. Professor Morgan watched it all with a mixture of emotions: amazement at Eleanor's unconventional journey, regret for his initial dismissal of her, and a growing sense that something important was happening in his classroom, something that transcended the day's lesson plan. He glanced at his watch and realized that the class period was nearly over. "We'll continue with our scheduled material tomorrow," he announced. "Please read Chapter 7 for the next class." As the students began gathering their things, Professor Morgan made a decision. He approached Eleanor, who was surrounded by a small group of curious students. "Miss Thompson," he said, "I wonder if you might be willing to meet me for coffee after class. I have a proposition I'd like to discuss with you." The university coffee shop buzzed with afternoon activity. Students hunched over laptops, professors graded papers, and the hiss of the espresso machine provided a steady background rhythm. Professor Morgan secured a quiet table in the corner, away from the main traffic flow, and waited for Eleanor to arrive. His mind raced with possibilities. In just 2 days, this unassuming elderly woman had completely upended his expectations and, if he was honest with himself, challenged some of his deepest assumptions about teaching, learning, and who belonged in the world of academic mathematics. He spotted Eleanor making her way through the crowded shop. She moved carefully between the tables, apologizing softly when she needed to squeeze past a chair or backpack. A few students from his class recognized her and nudged their friends, whispering behind their hands. Word had spread quickly. "I hope I didn't keep you waiting," Eleanor said as she reached the table. "I had to make a phone call to my neighbor about feeding my cat." "Not at all." Professor Morgan stood and pulled out a chair for her. "What would you like to drink? It's my treat." "Just tea, if they have it. Nothing fancy." When he returned with her tea and his coffee, Eleanor was looking around the coffee shop with interest. "It's been years since I've been on a university campus," she said. "So much energy in these places. All these young minds figuring out who they are and what they want to do with their lives." Professor Morgan nodded, stirring his coffee absently. "I sometimes forget that part of it. After 20 years of teaching, it's easy to see them just as students rather than as people at a crucial junction in their lives." Eleanor took a sip of her tea. "You mentioned you had a proposition for me, Professor?" "James, please." He set his spoon down. "And yes, I do, but first I owe you an apology." Eleanor tilted her head questioningly. "When you first came to my class, I made assumptions about you based solely on your age," he admitted. "I was dismissive and, frankly, condescending. I thought you were just a retiree looking for a way to pass the time, not someone with a genuine passion and talent for mathematics. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Eleanor's expression softened. "There's no need to apologize. People have been underestimating me my whole life." She smiled. "It makes proving them wrong all the more satisfying." Professor Morgan laughed. "I can imagine." He took a deep breath. "Ms. Thompson?" "Eleanor, please." "Eleanor," he corrected himself. "Your understanding of mathematics is remarkable, especially considering your unconventional path. The approach you demonstrated yesterday, I found it in a Russian journal from the 1970s. How did you come across it?" Eleanor's eyes lit up. "Ah, the Sokolov method. I discovered it in an international mathematics journal at the public library, around 1975. The library only had a few issues, but that particular one caught my attention. I spent weeks working through his approach, translating the Cyrillic characters with a dictionary I borrowed. It was like finding buried treasure." "That's exactly what struck me," Professor Morgan leaned forward. You not only understood complex mathematical concepts, but you sought them out from diverse sources, integrated them into your own understanding, and developed unique approaches along the way. Eleanor nodded. When you're teaching yourself, you don't always know the standard way to do things. Sometimes that's a disadvantage, but sometimes it leads you down interesting paths. That's precisely why I wanted to speak with you, Professor Morgan said. Your story yesterday made quite an impression on my students, and on me. The perspective you bring, both mathematically and personally, is valuable in ways that textbooks and lectures often aren't. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I'd like to invite you to give a guest lecture to my class, not as a student auditing the course, but as someone with valuable knowledge to share. Eleanor's eyes widened. A lecture? Me? She set her teacup down, her hand trembling slightly. But I don't have any formal qualifications. I've never taught before. Qualifications come in many forms, Professor Morgan replied. Your lifetime of self-directed study and your unique problem-solving approaches are exactly what many of my students need to see. Too often, they think mathematics is just about memorizing formulas and passing exams. Your passion for the subject, your persistence in learning despite obstacles, these are lessons just as important as any equation I could put on a board. Eleanor looked down at her weathered hands, wrapped around the teacup. What would I even talk about? Whatever you'd like, he said. Perhaps your approach to differential equations, or maybe the connections you see between mathematics and the physical world. Or you could share some of the unconventional methods you've developed over the years. A group of students at a nearby table burst into laughter over something on a phone screen. Eleanor glanced their way, then back to Professor Morgan. I've spent most of my life keeping my mathematical interests private, she said quietly. My co-workers at the telephone company used to joke about my number hobby, as if I was collecting stamps or birdwatching. Only Robert, my mentor, truly understood what it meant to me. She traced the rim of her teacup with a finger. It's strange to suddenly have people interested in hearing what I have to say. Sometimes life surprises us, Professor Morgan said, often when we least expect it. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at students crossing the campus green. When she turned back, there was a new resolve in her eyes. All right, she said, I'll do it. On one condition. What's that? That you don't introduce me as some kind of mathematical prodigy or genius, she said firmly. I'm just someone who loved a subject enough to pursue it against the odds. Whatever I've accomplished came through persistence, not brilliance. Professor Morgan nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he agreed with her assessment. I can do that. How about next Tuesday? That would give you time to prepare. Tuesday would be fine, Eleanor said. She took another sip of tea, then set the cup down decisively. I should tell you something else, though. Something I didn't mention yesterday. Oh? I didn't just study mathematics on my own, she said. I also tried to contribute to it in my small way. Professor Morgan leaned forward, intrigued. What do you mean? Over the years, I wrote up some of my findings and approaches, Eleanor explained. Solutions to problems, different ways of looking at mathematical concepts, even a few theorems I believed I'd developed. I would send them to mathematics journals under the name E.T. Thompson. Did any of them get published? Professor Morgan asked. Eleanor's eyes crinkled with a smile. 3 did, between 1977 and 1989. Nothing revolutionary, mind you, just small contributions to the field. Professor Morgan stared at her. That's incredible. Many professional mathematicians go their entire careers without publishing a single paper. Do you still have copies? Of course. I keep them in a special folder at home along with all the rejection letters. She laughed softly. There were many more of those, believe me. A new respect washed over Professor Morgan. This woman hadn't just studied mathematics in isolation. She'd tried to join the conversation, to add her voice to the academic discourse despite all the barriers in her way. I'd love to read them, he said sincerely. I'll bring them on Tuesday, she promised. Then her expression turned thoughtful. There's something else I've been working on, off and on, for almost 20 years now. A problem in number theory that caught my interest. I believe I've made some progress on it, but I've never had anyone to discuss it with, anyone who might understand. I'd be happy to take a look, Professor Morgan offered. Number theory isn't my primary field, but I might be able to point you toward resources or colleagues who specialize in it. Thank you, Eleanor said. That would mean a great deal to me. They talked for another hour, their conversation flowing, easily from mathematical topics to life experiences and back again. Professor Morgan found himself sharing stories of his own journey through academia, the challenges, the setbacks, the moments of discovery and connection that had kept him going. Eleanor was an attentive listener, asking insightful questions and offering perspectives he'd never considered. Despite the decades that separated them, he found they had much in common. A love of elegant solutions, a fascination with the patterns underlying reality, and a belief in the power of mathematics to reveal truths about the world. As the coffee shop began to empty for the dinner hour, Professor Morgan realized something remarkable had happened. He'd invited Eleanor for coffee out of professional curiosity, but somewhere during their conversation, the lines between professor and auditor, teacher and student, had blurred. They were simply two people sharing a passion, each with something valuable to learn from the other. I should be getting home, Eleanor said, glancing at her watch. My cat gets grumpy if dinner is late, even when the neighbors feed him. Professor Morgan stood. Let me walk you to your car. Oh, I don't drive anymore, Eleanor said. My eyesight isn't what it used to be. I take the bus to campus. The bus? But that must be quite a journey, she shrugged. An hour each way, but it's worth it. At least let me call you a taxi, he offered. That's very kind, but unnecessary. The bus stop is just across the street, and the ride gives me time to think. Some of my best mathematical insights have come while watching the world pass by through a bus window. As they walked out of the coffee shop together, several students nodded in greeting, their eyes following Eleanor with newfound respect. Professor Morgan noticed the change with satisfaction. In just 2 days, she had transformed from an oddity to someone worthy of admiration. At the edge of campus, Eleanor turned to him. Thank you for this opportunity, James. For most of my life, mathematics has been a private joy. The idea of sharing it with others. It's both terrifying and exciting. The students will learn a great deal from you, Professor Morgan said. As I already have. Eleanor smiled, the late afternoon sun highlighting the web of wrinkles that spoke of a long life, fully lived. Until Tuesday, then. As he watched her walk toward the bus stop, Professor Morgan felt a sense of anticipation he hadn't experienced in years. His carefully planned curriculum had been disrupted in the most unexpected way, but he couldn't bring himself to mind. Sometimes, he reflected, the most valuable lessons were the ones you never saw coming. By Tuesday morning, the largest lecture hall on campus had been reserved for Eleanor's guest lecture. Word had spread far beyond Professor Morgan's advanced calculus class. Mathematics students from all years had asked to attend. Several professors from related departments requested seats. Even the university president had expressed interest after hearing about the remarkable self-taught mathematician from the dean. Professor Morgan felt a twinge of worry as he watched the hall fill up. Had he put too much pressure on Eleanor? She had agreed to speak to his class of 30 students, not an audience of nearly 200. He scanned the crowd for her familiar silver hair and blue cardigan but didn't see her. The clock ticked closer to the scheduled start time. Students continued to file in, filling even the steps along the sides of the lecture hall. The buzz of conversation grew louder as people speculated about what they were about to witness. Have you heard about her? They say she solved a problem that stumped Professor Morgan. I heard she published papers in mathematics journals while working as a telephone operator. My roommate was in the class when she first showed what she could do, said it was like watching someone speak a foreign language with perfect fluency. 5 minutes before the lecture was set to begin, Professor Morgan spotted Eleanor standing hesitantly at the back entrance to the hall. She wore a simple navy dress he hadn't seen before, and her silver hair was arranged more carefully than usual. In her arms, she carried a worn leather folder tied with a faded ribbon. He made his way through the crowd to her side. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "are you all right? I'm afraid word got out and we have quite a turnout." Eleanor's eyes were wide as she took in the packed lecture hall. "I wasn't expecting so many people," she whispered. "I'm not sure my notes are adequate for such a large audience." Perhaps this was a mistake. Professor Morgan could see the anxiety in her face. For a moment, he regretted the whole idea. "We can cancel if you want," he offered. "Or postpone until we can arrange something smaller." Eleanor took a deep breath, her gaze moving across the sea of expectant faces. Then her expression changed, settling into a calm determination he recognized from when she approached the chalkboard in his classroom. "No," she said firmly. "I've spent my whole life with these ideas locked inside me. It's time to share them, whether it's with 30 people or 200. She patted the leather folder. "Besides, I brought my papers to show you, as I promised." Relief washed over Professor Morgan. "Let me introduce you then." They made their way to the front of the lecture hall, whispers following in their wake. When they reached the podium, Professor Morgan raised his hands, and the room gradually quieted. "Good morning," he began. "Many of you have heard rumors about why we're gathered here today. Some of those rumors might even be true." A gentle laugh rippled through the audience. "But before we begin, I want to thank you all for coming and ask that you extend the same courtesy and respect to our guest speaker that you would to any visiting professor or mathematician." He turned slightly toward Eleanor, who stood quietly beside him. 3 weeks ago, Ms. Eleanor Thompson walked into my advanced calculus class as an auditing student. She told me mathematics had been a lifelong hobby, but I soon discovered she was being extraordinarily modest. Professor Morgan recounted the story of Eleanor's demonstration in class, her explanation of the differential equation, and the subsequent revelation of her self-taught journey through higher mathematics. Today, at my invitation, Ms. Thompson has agreed to share some of her unique perspectives on mathematics, perspectives gained not through traditional academic channels, but through decades of independent study driven by pure passion for the subject. As she requested, I won't introduce her as a genius or prodigy, but simply as someone who has devoted a lifetime to the pursuit of mathematical understanding against considerable odds. He stepped back from the podium. "Please welcome Ms. Eleanor Thompson." The applause was enthusiastic. Eleanor placed her folder on the podium and adjusted the microphone. For a moment, she simply looked out at the audience, her hands resting lightly on the wooden surface before her. "Thank you, Professor Morgan," she began, her voice soft but clear. "And thank you all for coming today, though I'm not entirely sure what you're expecting." She opened her folder and took out several handwritten pages. "I've never given a lecture before. I've never stood in front of a group of people who wanted to hear what I had to say about mathematics. So please forgive me if my presentation lacks the polish you're accustomed to." Eleanor paused, looking down at her notes, then set them aside. "I had prepared a rather technical talk about alternative approaches to differential equations, but standing here now, I realize there might be something more valuable I can share with you today." She stepped out from behind the podium, moving to the center of the stage area. "Mathematics has been called the language of the universe. It's a perfect language in many ways, precise, universal, elegant. But like any language, it can be approached in different ways. Some learn it in classrooms with expert guidance. Others, like me, learn it in stolen moments, in the quiet hours before dawn, or late at night when the rest of the world is sleeping." The hall was utterly silent now, every person leaning forward slightly, drawn in by the quiet authority in Eleanor's voice. "When I was a young woman," she continued, "the doors to advanced mathematical education were largely closed to me. Not officially, perhaps, but practically. Financial constraints, family obligations, social expectations, they all created barriers that seemed insurmountable. But the beauty of mathematics called to me in a way I couldn't ignore." Eleanor moved toward the large chalkboard that spanned the wall behind her. She picked up a piece of chalk and began to write, her hand steady and sure. "This equation," she said, completing a complex formula, represents a problem in number theory I've been working on for nearly 20 years. It's related to the distribution of prime numbers, a field that has fascinated mathematicians for centuries. She began explaining the equation, breaking down its components with remarkable clarity. Even students who normally struggled with abstract mathematical concepts found themselves following along, guided by Eleanor's intuitive explanations and everyday analogies. "You see," she said, "when I couldn't understand a concept from a textbook, I had to find my own way in. I'd relate it to something concrete in the world around me, the pattern of leaves on a plant, the way water spirals down a drain, the rhythm of traffic lights on my bus route. Mathematics isn't separate from the world. It's woven into its very fabric." For the next 45 minutes, Eleanor led the audience through her unique approach to mathematical thinking. She shared stories of solving complex problems while riding the bus to work, of scribbling equations on napkins during her lunch breaks, of the breakthrough moment that led to her first published paper. She showed them the actual journals containing her published work, faded with age, but carefully preserved. When she displayed the byline E.T. Thompson on the overhead projector, the audience broke into spontaneous applause. But the most powerful moment came when Eleanor revealed her current work. Over the past 2 decades, she had developed an approach to a long-standing problem in number theory that offered a potential new pathway to its solution. "I'm not claiming to have solved it completely," she said modestly. "Greater minds than mine have worked on this problem for centuries, but perhaps my unconventional perspective might contribute something useful to the conversation." Professor Chen from the physics department raised his hand. "Ms. Thompson, have you considered that your approach shares similarities with recent work in quantum field theory? The parallel structures are quite striking." Eleanor looked surprised. "I'm not familiar with quantum field theory, I'm afraid. My reading in physics hasn't extended that far. Yet you've independently developed a mathematical framework that physicists have only recently begun to explore," Professor Chen said, excitement evident in his voice. "This could have significant implications." Other professors began to ask questions, engaging with Eleanor's ideas with genuine interest and respect. Far from being intimidated, she responded thoughtfully, sometimes acknowledging the limits of her knowledge but often offering insights that made even the experts pause and reconsider their assumptions. Throughout the discussion, Professor Morgan watched from the side of the stage, a sense of wonder growing within him. He had taught thousands of students over his career, had attended hundreds of lectures by distinguished mathematicians, but he had never witnessed anything quite like this. A self-taught woman in her 70s commanding the attention and respect of an entire mathematics department through the sheer power of her passion and perseverance. When the scheduled time came to an end, no one seemed ready to leave. Questions continued, conversations sparked among audience members, and small groups formed to discuss the implications of Eleanor's approach. It was only when the next class began filtering in that Professor Morgan reluctantly stepped forward to bring the session to a close. "I believe we've kept Ms. Thompson long enough for today," he announced, "but I'm pleased to share that she has agreed to become a special visiting lecturer for our department this semester, offering a series of talks on her unique mathematical approaches." This announcement, arranged with the dean just that morning, brought another round of enthusiastic applause. Eleanor looked startled but pleased, her cheeks flushed with color. As the crowd began to disperse, students and faculty members approached Eleanor, introducing themselves, asking for copies of her papers, inviting her to departmental events. Professor Morgan stayed nearby, making sure she wasn't overwhelmed, but Eleanor handled the attention with natural grace. When the last well-wishers had departed, Eleanor gathered her papers with trembling hands. "I never imagined," she began, then shook her head, words failing her. Professor Morgan smiled. "You've opened a door today, Eleanor, not just for yourself but for everyone in that audience. You've shown them that mathematics isn't confined to classrooms or academic journals, that it's a living, breathing pursuit available to anyone with the passion to follow it." Eleanor carefully retied the ribbon around her folder. "For 70, Years I've loved mathematics from a distance, like admiring a beautiful painting through a window. Today, for the first time, I feel like I've stepped inside the frame. As they walked together across the campus green, students called out greetings to Eleanor, several professors stopped to congratulate her, and the dean himself came over to discuss arrangements for her lecture series. "Your life is going to be quite different now," Professor Morgan observed as they continued toward the bus stop. Eleanor looked up at the university buildings around them, at the students hurrying to classes, at the world she had admired from afar for so long. "Yes," she agreed, a smile spreading across her face. "Yes, I believe it is." She paused, turning to Professor Morgan with eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible, for hearing me when I was silent." "Professor." Morgan shook his head. "No, Eleanor. Thank you for reminding me why I became a teacher in the first place, not just to impart knowledge, but to recognize and nurture the potential in others, wherever and whenever it appears." As Eleanor boarded her bus, waving goodbye through the window, Professor Morgan reflected on the strange journey of the past 3 weeks. What had begun as an irritating interruption to his orderly classroom had become one of the most profound experiences of his professional life. He had set out to teach advanced calculus to a group of young university students. Instead, he had learned an even more valuable lesson from an elderly woman with a weathered notebook and a lifelong passion for mathematics: that true education has no age limit, no prescribed path, and no barriers that determination cannot overcome. And that sometimes the most extraordinary minds are found in the most ordinary places, waiting only for someone to notice them, to challenge them, and to give them the chance to shine.